Bear Diaries. These are the diaries of a gay kid in the 90s opened up for the world to read. This is a true story. Names and locations have been altered to protect anonymity. The diaries were written over several years and it can be a bit tedious to go through them all, although often quite well worth it. In 2006, I wrote an essay for a course I was taking at the time based off my diaries. The assignment was to write an autoethnography about the most difficult thing you ever dealt with. Autoethnography is pretty much just a fancy academic term for an autobiography or one's life story. I am presenting this essay now because it summarizes quite poignantly my coming out story and my coming of age story as a young gay man in the 1990s. Oh, and it explains why these diaries are called the Polar Bear Diaries. Autoethnography. My personal and public struggle with coming to terms with my sexual orientation. October 31, 2006. I knew I was different as far back as I can remember. When I was 4 years old, I used to wrap a blanket around my waist and pretend it was a skirt. I used to hang pants from my head and pretend I had long hair and I would walk on toes as if I was wearing high-heeled shoes. I did all of this when I thought my mum was not looking because I knew she would disapprove. One day in 1983, my mum told me all about faggots. She told me there was a boy she went to school with and all the kids made fun of him because he was a faggot. She told me that faggots were bad people who live miserable lives. I knew she was talking about me, and I now had a word for my difference. I knew when I was 4 that I was a faggot. From that early age, the stage was set for the unfolding of the rest of my life. As a gay child, there were 2 major challenges I had to face. One challenge was the inner struggle to understand my sexuality and how I was going to live with being gay. The other struggle was a very public one. It was the struggle to cope with the violence and abuse that effeminate boys are so often the target of. Each of these struggles impacts on the other. I will first discuss how I came to understand my sexuality and gender and how I responded to that understanding. Then, I will talk about the abuse I suffered at school because I was a gay child. Even though being gay is usually thought of as a sexual orientation, my earliest recognition of myself being different, or a faggot, was based on how I experienced my gender. I remember thinking that I did not like boys and that I did not want to be a boy. I thought girls were very pretty and I wanted to look like them. I used to watch He-Man, which was a violent fantasy cartoon targeted at boys. My favorite character on the show was not the protagonist, He-Man, but the witch. In fact, I loved witches and I always wanted to be a witch for Halloween, but my parents never let me. When I was 4 years old, my sister, Ashley, was born. I was so glad she was a girl because I wanted a sister much more than I wanted a brother. Ashley proved to be an excellent sister for me. We would play Barbies for hours. Our games of Barbies were distinctly X-rated and revealed an imagination far more corrupt than one would expect from children. I knew that my parents did not like that I was playing with dolls, especially my dad, but they tolerated the game, maybe because they could not really stop us. Our other childhood games also indicated the fluidity of my gender identification. When we would play house or other games, the gender role that I played fluctuated. Sometimes I was the husband and she was the wife, but lots of times we were both women. Ashley understood my gender difference from her earliest days and she never questioned it. She grew up with it, so for her it was natural. As my childhood wore on, I always kept it in the back of my mind that I was a faggot. I did not spend much time thinking about it, but the thought would occasionally come into my head. I would just think to myself, yes, you're a fag, but don't think about that, Robbie, because one day you will have to deal with that, but this is the one part of your life when you don't have to deal with it, so just put it out of your mind. I think that was a very healthy coping strategy. My awareness of my queerness was beyond a level that I could process at that time. So, I just put it on the back burner, as something to grapple with at a later date. Part of my childhood dread in thinking about my future as a gay adult was rooted in the emergence of AIDS. My early awareness of being gay was at the same time that AIDS was first being reported in the media. Representations of AIDS as a gay disease instilled a tremendous amount of fear in me in terms of what my future might hold. While my gender difference was very clear to me from the beginning, my sexual difference took a lot longer for me to figure out. For most of my childhood, I was attracted to girls. I remember having a big crush on Sharon Stone in the movie Total Recall. I also had several crushes on girls at school. I even had a few childhood girlfriends. My first kiss was with a girl named Laura. In addition to my early attraction to girls, I do remember having a crush on a boy in kindergarten. After him, I was basically heterosexual until grade 6, when my sexuality abruptly changed. It must have been puberty and the accompanying rush of hormones because I was sexually attracted to boys like never before. I remember that I did not want to acknowledge it. I tried to keep it bottled up and I would not really let my mind wander to that place where I would think about boys. But one day, I did. It was in grade 6 and our school was having an assembly. All the students from every grade were in the gym. There was this grade 7 boy whom I had known for a long time. But this time, I looked at him differently. He was gorgeous and I could not take my eyes off him. I let my mind wander down a homoerotic corridor that until that point I had closed off in my head. I was just curious about how turned on I would feel if I imagined him without any clothes on. The feeling was overpowering and I was really shocked at how lustful I felt. It was like letting a genie out of a bottle and there was no going back. Once I went down that path in my mind, I knew I enjoyed the male form a million times more than the female. That was the beginning of a long period of sexual fantasies and exploration that culminated in my late teens, when I finally had sex with a boy for the first time. The fluidity of my childhood sexuality is something that I still do not fully understand. I really do think that I was genuinely aroused by women as a child and even in the first few years of adolescence. I had a girlfriend in grade 8 and I was genuinely attracted to her. However, as time went on, my attraction to men became so much stronger. Now, it has been 12 years since I felt any attraction for a female. Why the change? I have heard some gay men explain that they had girlfriends in their childhood because they were attracted to a girl's personality and it was really more like a female-to-female friendship than a heterosexual romance. That was not the case for me. I really was turned on by girls as a child, and occasionally turned on by boys, but over time, my attraction to boys won out. I cannot really explain it, other than to say that life is complex and sexuality is dynamic. I just hope that my sexuality does not change again. It also made figuring out my sexuality extremely difficult. After that day in the gym when I fantasized about the grade 7 boy, I could no longer put off the task of trying to understand my sexuality. That was the beginning of the most difficult years of my life. For years, I searched my soul for answers. Am I really gay? But what about my attraction to women? To whom am I attracted more? Women or men? If men, how can I change that? How can I make myself more attracted to women? How can I control my homosexuality? These are very difficult questions for a 13-year-old to figure out. I thought these things through with no help or guidance from parents or teachers or anyone. I explored these issues in a diary I wrote throughout my high school years. The diary was written in code so that if my mom read it, she would not know I was gay. It makes for disturbing reading for me today. In it, I talk about my vow to God to refrain from sex with men my whole life in return for heterosexuality in the afterlife. I was not even raised in a Christian family, but at times during my teen years, I turned to Christianity because I thought that would help me convert to being straight. I strongly wanted to be straight because I wanted to have kids and a family when I grew up. I did not think it was possible or desirable to raise kids in a gay relationship. In my diary, I was preoccupied with the question, what made me gay? I thought that if I had the answer to that question then I could begin the work of making myself straight. My diary entry on November 22, 1993 reveals a kid in a state of mental turmoil. I want to be a normal teenager. Why can't I have love? Why, God, did you make me gay and then make it a sin? Or did you? What made me gay? Maybe if I knew, I could break free. One of the explanations for what made me gay that I considered was the male violence I grew up with. I guess I read somewhere that boys can become gay due to a lack of a positive male role model. I do not consider my father to be a positive male role model. He beat and verbally abused my mother since I was an infant. I always intervened by calling the police or even positioning myself between them so that I would take the blows. From an early age, I resented my dad because of this. Maybe part of me still does think that part of the reason why I was, and continue to be, uncomfortable identifying as a man was because I did not like my dad, and I did not want to be like my dad. Between the ages of 14 to 16, I really came to grips with my sexuality. In that time, I decided that I was, in fact, gay, and that I had no sexual attraction for women. I also decided that my sexuality is innate and therefore it cannot be a sin against God. During this time, I became a big fan of opera, and I credit her show with helping me come to terms with my sexuality. My diary entry on September 16, 1995 shows that I was really ready to come out publicly with my sexuality. I wrote, "I'm not afraid of being gay, I'm shameless, in fact, I'm proud and celebrating. I love being gay." 1 month later, I came out, so now I will discuss my public battle with homophobic harassment and how I overcame that by coming out. As a child, I think I must have been visibly queer to most people. I displayed effeminate mannerisms and I enjoyed playing games that are usually associated with girls. The fact that my mum warned me about the perils of life as a faggot when I was 4 indicates that even my mum knew there was something going on. People read me as a sissy boy who needed sports to toughen me up. My grade 1 teacher commented in my report card that I was, quote, "a sensitive boy who has gained a great deal of self-confidence. Would benefit from outdoor sports." End quote. In grade 6, my teacher took me aside one day in PE class. He wanted to teach me how to throw a ball like a boy. He actually said that I threw like a girl. I was mortified. Looking back, I guess he thought he was doing me a favor. Maybe he thought that if I could throw like a boy, then I would not be picked on so much. To be an effeminate boy is to challenge the very core of patriarchy and masculinism. Part of straight boys' coming of age is being physically aggressive and athletic. I flagrantly did not conform to the male gender role as a child, and that motivated straight boys who felt a need to express their machismo to target me for harassment and violence. When you are a sissy boy in this position, you no longer have male privilege. In fact, the fact that you are anatomically male is a liability because effeminacy displayed by females goes unpunished, and even tomboyishness to some extent. Being effeminate was just one more way that made me different from everyone else. I was poor at a very affluent school. I walked to school, whereas most of the other kids were driven in fancy cars. I carried my books in a plastic bag, while everyone else had backpacks. And I was white, while most of the other boys were Chinese and spoke Cantonese to each other. Because I stood out so much from the other kids, I was teased and picked on since kindergarten. However, it was not until grade 6 that the teasing started to be in terms of my sexuality and gender. Just as I was growing more aware of my sexuality in grade 6, my peers began to understand that what was different about me was my sexuality. The first time I was teased for being gay, the teasers accused me of being a lesbian. They said I was a lesbian who was trying to fool everyone to make them believe that I was a boy, when in fact, I was a lesbian girl. I was so frustrated that I almost exposed my penis to them. Looking back at this early incident of homophobia, I actually have an understanding for where my classmates were coming from. These were kids who knew me well ever since kindergarten. I played dolls with some of them. They were trying to articulate that they knew I was queer, but they did not have an adequate conceptual basis to talk about that. It was easier for them to understand me as a girl posing as a boy than as a feminine boy. By grade 7, many of my classmates became much more mean-spirited with their harassment. Every day, I was made to feel subhuman. I had rocks thrown at me and I was spit on. On a school camping trip, I had human feces thrown at me. I never complained to teachers or to my parents because I feared that they would find out then that I was gay. My teachers must have known something was going on, but they never did anything to help me. When I started high school in grade 8, I thought I had a chance to not be teased. My mum made me change my name from Robbie to Rob because she said it sounded more masculine. Most of the kids at my high school were from different elementary schools and knew nothing about me. In fact, for the first 3 months of grade 8, I was one of the most popular kids. I had a girlfriend and I made lots of new friends. But I knew that my past and effeminacy would catch up with me. On the very first day of high school, all of the grade 8s gathered in the auditorium so that the school administrators could assign us to homerooms. It was there that I overheard a boy from my elementary school, Mark, telling others that I was gay. It took 3 months for the rumor to saturate the school, a startlingly long time, and those were the best 3 months of my childhood. During those 3 months, the rumor grew until it reached a point that my new friends stopped being my friends because I had become so unpopular that it was affecting them. None of the other guys wanted to risk being labeled gay. From that point on, I was known as the gay boy, and I was completely shunned. No one would talk to me and no one ever wanted to be my partner on school projects. Homophobic slurs were the routine and became so normal that they did not really evoke a response in me. Because of that, it is actually hard to remember specific incidents. I remember one time Mark saw me eating French fries and said, Don't deep throat those fries, Rob. I could not even eat fries without getting a reaction, and that just made me want to become invisible. I spent lunch reading in the library, tucked away in a corner, hoping no one would find me. High school for me was not only lonely, it was dangerous. Several times, people threatened to beat me up. I was often pursued by boys promising violence after school. Luckily, I was a quick runner, and I was always able to outrun those who wanted to assault me after school. Maybe that is why I was fast. I had lots of practice running. I also was really good at getting a head start on my way home. I would bring all my books and everything I needed for the night's homework with me to my last class so that I would not have to go to my locker afterwards. This way, I could leave the school immediately after the bell rang. If I forgot to bring to my last class a textbook that I might need that night, I had a choice: go to my locker and get the book and risk being beaten up, or do not do my homework. When you are a visibly gay male teen, every move you make is calculated for your own self-preservation. I learned to be cagey, and it is a skill I still have. It really is amazing I was never gay bashed because other boys certainly did want to harm me. One of the few times I asked for help from a teacher was when a student threatened to do a drive-by shooting at my home and murder my entire family. In that case, I told my counselor and risked exposing my sexual orientation to her and my parents because I could not risk the safety of my family. The counselor spoke to the boy and he promised to not follow through on the threat. In retrospect, I doubt he had access to a gun. However, perhaps he should have been dealt with more severely. After all, it is a crime to utter threats. On the other hand, he was not an exceptionally violent boy. All of my harassers were normal, run-of-the-mill boys. When these normal boys saw how effeminate I was, they felt justified in resorting to an extreme level of behavior that was totally out of character for them. I still do not really understand why so many boys feel that violence is a socially appropriate reaction when they meet an effeminate boy. Incidentally, girls never harassed me for being gay. I do understand that boys are socialized to be violent and that gay males challenge male gender norms and therefore evoke a violent reaction. Still, knowing that intellectually does not stop me from being somewhat puzzled when I recollect the extremes these average boys went to. My coming out process began in grade 11, when I went to the Gay and Lesbian Center's Friday night youth group. A boy at school, who turned out to be gay, told me about it, and I read about it in the newspaper. It took months for me to get the courage to actually go. I really did believe a lot of the negative stereotypes about gay men, and that kept me from going. I thought if I went, I would be molested by the gay male adults there. Despite that fear, I decided to go to the GLC on November 3, 1995, almost exactly 11 years ago. I remember it was just a few days after the sovereignty referendum in Quebec. I lied to my mum and told her that I was going on a class field trip to see Hamlet at the Ridge Theatre on Arbutus Street. I had never even been to Davie Street and I had no idea how to get there. I remember it was a crisp, clear fall night and a sense of anticipation and anxiety hung in the air. I managed to get to Broadway and Burrard by bus, and I took a cab the rest of the way. I walked through the door of the GLC and climbed the stairs with trepidation. The meeting was rather uneventful in terms of what happened. There was a girl from UBC talking about where all the various political parties stood on gay issues. I did not really talk to the other guys at the meeting, and at the end of the night, I accepted a ride home from a female group member's lesbian mother. I thought I would be safe from being molested if I was with a lesbian. The excitement of that night was not in the events of the evening, but in how I felt inside. I felt free. In my diary, I used an unusual, but effective metaphor for how I felt that night, quote, "How I felt was like a polar bear from a zoo in Mexico City, who is released in the Arctic for the first time. At first, the cold is a shock to him, but soon he feels more at home than ever before." End quote. I felt like I had found my people. My diary entry from that night shows that I saw society divided into two discrete worlds: the gay world of Davie Street, and the straight world everywhere else. Clearly, I had an essentialized understanding of what it was to be gay. I now understand that the gay-straight dichotomy that I perceived is very problematic and not really reflective of reality. Another passage in my diary from that night reminds me how othered I had felt prior to going to the GLC. Quote, "I've never felt so accepted, through my whole 16 years of life as I did for those short 2.5 hours. That is what it must be like for heteros all the time. I just felt so natural and normal. The heteros were the outsiders, The others. I love being gay. I'm counting the seconds until next Friday. The strange thing about the youth group was that, after a while, nobody seemed gay. It wasn't as gay specific as I thought it would be. End quote. This passage shows that I was really surprised that a whole gathering of gay people could appear so normal, so free of spectacle. Already, my essentialized and stereotypical notions of what it meant to be gay were starting to break down. I had forgotten until writing this assignment that one of the hardest parts of coming to terms with my sexuality was overcoming my own homophobic ideas about gay people that I had picked up from my parents and society. 6 days after that first night at the GLC, I told my mom I was gay. I wanted to keep going to the GLC and I knew I was not going to be able to keep lying to her. I stayed home from school on November 10, 1995, and I waited until after my dad had gone to work. I did not want to come out to my dad for many more years. I started by telling her that I loved her and that I appreciated all that she had done for me. But when it came time to actually say the words, "I am gay," to my mom, I could not. I cried hysterically on the living room floor for about 20 minutes. After spending my whole life trying to hide my sexuality from her, even after I decided in my mind to tell her, my lips were so programmed to keep the secret, I could not bring myself to complete the sentence and say the word gay. I told her to guess what it was. She was guessing all sorts of things. I did something that was going to cost her money, I was going to run away from home. Finally, she said, quote, "All I can think of is that you're trying to tell me that you're a homo." End quote. After a few seconds, I replied, "Yes," and with that single syllable, I was out to my mom. She told me that she still loved me and that I was confused. She told me to go to my room because she did not want to talk about it. She said she did not want to tell Dad because he would blame her for babying me. The hours and weeks that followed were very difficult. My mom did not want to believe what she had known since when I was 4 and she told me all about faggots. I had to really work hard to convince her that I knew I was gay, that I had no doubts, and that I had spent a lot of time thinking about it. I was very patient and I did not expect her to understand immediately. My mom's acceptance of my sexual orientation developed incrementally over many years. For a long time now, she has fully accepted and embraced my sexual orientation. I am very grateful to have such an excellent mom. I hold no grudges that she called me a homo, or that she instilled fear in me about faggots when I was a toddler. Homophobia is everywhere in our society and it would not be fair for me to expect my mom to automatically purge herself of it. It took me years to get over my homophobia, and I am gay myself. Maybe that is the most insidious aspect of homophobia. It turns us against ourselves and our loved ones. I did not go back to the GLC until late December of 1995. My mom told me she wanted to have one last Christmas under the delusion that I was straight. That was why she forbid me to go back until the new year. I respected her request and put off my self-discovery for a few more months. In 1996, I started going to the GLC on a regular basis. It was at that time that I changed my name back to Robbie and reclaimed my identity. Early 1996 was the beginning of the best years of my life. I made lifelong friends and I had a series of boyfriends and sexual experiences. My coming out was my coming of age and my initiation into adulthood. The next step in this process was coming out at school. Over just a few weeks of going to the GLC, I managed to gain an incredible amount of self-confidence. By early February of 1996, I was ready for the most courageous thing I ever did in my life. I decided to come out at school and risk my personal safety to stand up for my right to be myself. I realized that coming out at school would be a political act, because I would be showing that I was not ashamed of my sexuality, and I would be directly confronting the homophobia that was so rampant there. My strategy was to not make an announcement, but to just stop hiding the fact that I was gay. One day, I wore a bright red shirt with a zipper on the chest, and it really advertised that I was queer. At the end of the school day, I was at my locker and there were these 3 guys there who I knew. One of them asked me if I was gay. I said, yes. That was it. They just chuckled amongst themselves and I left the school. By the next morning, the whole school knew. I remember walking down the halls at 8:30 a.m., and hearing a buzz of whispers as I passed groups of students huddled by their lockers. Everyone was talking about it. I knew it would get around fast, but I was shocked by just how fast. Surprisingly, from that point forward, I experienced much greater Acceptance from my peers. I would estimate that about 90% of the students supported me. Several people came up to me and publicly voiced their support. One guy who had been my arch enemy since he stole my lunch in grade 1 even praised me. This was not what I was expecting. I was expecting the homophobia to get worse. The homophobia actually did get worse from a hardcore group of homophobes, but they were very outnumbered. One guy in particular became especially nasty. This guy, Jamil, came up to me in a school corridor and spewed a mouthful of hate at me. He said that I did not deserve to live, that I had a chemical imbalance in my brain and that God created AIDS to kill me. It was not anything I had not heard before, but the way he said it was so hateful that it really affected me. After he walked away, I just started crying in front of everyone in the halls. I really felt his hate for me. By the next school year, grade 12, Jamil did calm down somewhat. I think the principal talked to him, and everyone else supported me so much, that Jamil and the few guys who hated me were ostracized. After so many years of being socially excluded in school, I feel like in my last year, things were put right. By that time, however, I was sick of school that I hardly went. I started high school as a top achiever, but in the end, I did not even graduate. In grade 12, I was too enthralled in exploring a whole new world that had opened up to me. A world of all-night parties, sex, and drugs. I stayed in that world for many years. I did not return to my academic development again until 2003, when I started working on my bachelor's degree. I have tried to describe and analyze the most difficult thing I have ever had to deal with. Coming to terms, both internally and publicly, with my sexual orientation. That has been my life story. The fact that I am almost 28 and still an undergraduate is rooted in that struggle, so it affects me even now. But, it also is a tremendous source of strength for me. As a child, I had to figure out my sexuality and how to live with it. I had to deal with abuse at school on a daily basis, and I lived in a home of poverty and domestic violence. I do not know how I did it. My life is pretty comfortable right now compared to all that, and I would not want to go through it over again. I really admire the strength I possessed as a child, and I know that strength is still deep within me. Looking back, I realize I had a sophisticated intellect as a child, from the time I was 4 and I was aware that I was queer. This is where I draw my confidence from, and this is what motivates me to excel in university. I feel like I have something to share with the world as a result of coming through all of this, and I hope that academia will give me the tools to do that. This assignment has been the first opportunity for me to share my story in the academic realm, so I sincerely thank you, Misha, for that.